George Floyd's recent death has led to some seismic events and moments in the US, and we're seeing some of the reverberations in the UK and other countries around the world as well. And because of that, I've decided to do a short series of videos entitled To the Moon and Black. Now, to the Moon and Back is something that's quite well known in Western vernacular. I love you to the moon and back, meaning that I love you or I love this thing more than anything else. And I've chosen this title because I feel it's time to start really appreciating the worth of blackness and black excellence. However, I will say with a caveat that this is not to promote black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. And as a Muslim, I want to place the self-worth of us as individuals, or an individual's self-worth, within religious and definable context, because we cannot have that, as we call it in Arabic, in Islam, that asabiya, that partisanship and strong nationalism above that of Islam, or in place of Islam and the values that are espoused by our faith. So I want to make that clear from the outset. But I also want to make it clear that that discarding of cultural aspects that don't conflict with our faith is something that we as black people, converts in particular, Western individuals, need to find a balance for. Because when we embrace Islam, there's an encouragement to embrace other cultures. So some of us embraced the South Asian culture, for example, understanding that to be Islam. Many of us embraced Arab culture, wearing the shamak and the thobe. And I'm not speaking against these, but to eschew, to discard one's identity is not what Islam has instructed us to do in that regard. So aims of this particular video and the subsequent ones is going to look at structural and systemic racism within our societies and touch upon some elements of that. But it's also going to focus on looking at racism within our own communities, the predominant Muslim communities in the West, and how they interact with, and how we as black Muslims interact with, and non-Muslim black entities interact with these particular faith groups, these particular community groups, these particular cultural groups. Another aim of this short series is for us to focus on our identities, who we are, where we originate from. Because as one saying that I like to cite often goes, black history did not start with slavery. It was interrupted by it. And I think it's important that we explore what our identities were preceding the slave era, transatlantic slavery, and any form of slavery. Because many of us and many of our colleagues from other denominations of faith, from other cultures, always tend to start at that particular point as well. And even within Islam, one of the illustrious companions, Bilal ibn Rabah, is referenced often that he was also a slave, and look at him now, and look at where he rose in the status of the noble companions of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And while that's fine, he shouldn't be our only reference point, because blackness as a characteristic, as blackness as a trait, as a descriptor, was there amongst the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and many of his companions. But it's also for us to develop some self-worth, because one of the things that keeps being referred to amongst black communities is that self-hate, that self-loathing. And for those who don't understand it, it's not just necessarily hating yourself, it's how you interact and how you perceive your colleagues of similar or same backgrounds or ethnicities. And we see a lot of the violence that is inflicted between ourselves. We see broken homes, and some of that is attributed to self-hate, self-loathing. And I'm not going to get into the sciences of that because there are experts who deal with that. I'm not an expert in that field. But as someone who's coming obviously from that background, it's important that this discussion, this dialogue takes place. Again, it's not a call to nationalism. It's not a call to black pride in the sense of having disdain and looking down on others. We have that carnal sin in the Quran, in Islam, as well as in Christianity, where we see the pride of Satan, the devil, Iblis. And obviously, we as Muslims hold the final revelation to have more accuracy around that story, in which Iblis refused to bow in obedience to Allah to the creation of Adam, the first man. And I'll be touching upon Adam's creation and the elements of that in future series. So for now, the Islamic premise will be something that features throughout what I'm speaking about. So when I talk about knowing self-worth, knowing our identity, having that sense of black pride that is permissible for us to have, speaking about black excellence, all of this is with the ultimate objective of knowing how to direct and focus beyond the constraints of the societies that have been repressing us, beyond the scope and the parameters and constricts of the societies that have been limiting us and hemming in our abilities to progress. It shouldn't be that we have been told how high we can jump and we jump that high. We need to be able to excel beyond that. And again, to the moon and black, we need to be able to love ourselves. But the ultimate objective is that we focus on an ultimate love to our Creator. And therein we will transcend the borders and the boundaries that have constricted our progress and the negative perceptions that are there on us that end up being reinforced by us fulfilling stereotypes, by us reinforcing some of the negative portrayals from community members, by realizing the Creator and how that can enable us to transcend all of these strictures. I will read from some of my notes now, taken from books that I've read around this topic. And in the book entitled Centering the Black Narrative, the authors wrote, "To ignore the subject of race in our times is tantamount to giving tacit approval to mass murder, inequitable allocation of government resources, incarceration disparities, political overrepresentation, economic disadvantage, and educational inaccessibility." The authors went on to continue, "It justifies shedding tears for the murder of French babies, but not those who belong to the Iraqi parents. It legitimizes intervention in European genocides, but not those happening in Africa. It condones the mistreatment of the victims of police brutality, not the victimizers. It also leads us to conclude First Amendment rights belong only to white European faces. Finally, ignoring the uncomfortable subject of race in our times causes us to claim to be living in a post-racial world, a world which suddenly surprises us when we find racist demagogues the frontrunners in our national politics." And that's where we are today. It's okay to bemoan and show empathy for a particular type of nation or victim due to that construct of race, and if they are of a fairer hue. But if they happen to be the alien other, Iraqi children, for example, African children, Indian children, on different continents or subcontinents, then little attention is given, and if any is given, it's for a shorter span of time than it is when it's closer to home and people that the predominant society can relate to. I want to refer to a couple of elephants in the room. One from a societal perspective, first and foremost, and then the second one on a more micro level, looking at communities, Muslim communities at that. And I will read from Robin DiAngelo's book, Why White People Find It Difficult to Talk About Racism, because she provides a very good illustration and analogy of societal structures that reinforce racism. And she says here, imagine a pier stretching out over the water. Viewed from above, the pier appears to simply float there. The top of the pier, the part that we can see, signifies the surface. Yet while the pier seems to float without any effort, it is of course not floating at all. It is propped up by a structure submerged under the water. The pier rests on pillars embedded in the ocean floor. In the same way, the pier sits on submerged pillars that are not immediately visible. The belief structure supporting racism are hidden from our view. To topple the pier, we need to access and uproot the pillars. And hopefully, we're seeing more of that happen today, following George's murder. And this isn't new. We can go back to the civil rights movement. We know the personalities of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, the formation and establishment of the Black Panther movement in 1966, and many others. Huey Newton from the Black Panthers. We could mention many who tried to dismantle what was below the surface of society. And it's important that that move, that focus is galvanized again, and hopefully, as I've said, that's taking place today. And we've seen something slightly different. Yes, the liberal left has been galvanized, but it's not only the liberal left that we're seeing normal white communities, middle class whites, realizing their white privilege, realizing their fragility, and saying we've been living in a bubble, and recognizing that the microaggressions and the macroaggressions that Black Americans, Black people have been subjected to on a daily basis. And that's why you're seeing these marches, these protests. There's opportunism taking place at the moment as well, because you're seeing amongst blacks and whites the looting and the rioting. And these cannot be condoned and justified whatsoever. However, in some instances, that's a learned behaviour. I call it a cannibalism of your own community. That's a learned behaviour, because black bodies have been looted and rioted upon since colonial times. And that's all that has been inherited from the negative aspects that have been placed upon some communities, the black community in particular. The second elephant in the room is the micro level, as I've just mentioned at the outset of the elephants in the room. And that's amongst Muslim communities. There's some poetry here that was compiled, and a colleague that I work with shared it with me because it's in Arabic and English. And it was meant to be in memory of the black people who were killed in America over the years. But it wanted to focus on George Floyd most recently. And I want to read some of this poetry. It was in Arabic and English, as I've said, and I verified with some of my colleagues who were conversant in Arabic whether the English was accurate. And the reason I want to refer to this is because it shows sometimes that despite the good intention, elements of prejudice or superiority permeate some of our co-religionists, whether they be Arab, whether they be South Asian, or whatever. And an element of anti-blackness is there in that superiority. And some of it, again, can be subconscious. Just like many of the white people now in society, British, American society, are waking up to their privilege, it's time that some of our co-religionists from the more predominant communities in the West, Arab communities, South Asian communities, wake up to a subconscious and inherent racism that pervades aspects and some communities that we as black people interact with. And The poetry here takes a dig at the West, it mocks it a little bit, but it's how it describes George I find offensive, and some of my colleagues who've since read it have found offensive. And I spoke to my Arab colleague today and explained why it was offensive, even though it wasn't meant that way. And it starts with the title being, "It's Not Necessary to Breathe." Now imagine, that's the title, "It's Not Necessary to Breathe," when we have Malcolm X with famous statements saying, "That's not a chip on my shoulder, that's your foot on my neck." We have statements like that. So to have a joking, light-hearted statement, so-called light-hearted statement as the title of this poetry, in itself smacks of ignorance and prejudice, albeit subconscious. So it starts, "We are now in the land of humanity, civilization and progress. We are in America, the state of Minnesota specifically. The sounds of auto machines, their horns, the facades of buildings and people's clothes make us feel the degree of progress for those living in this part of the universe. A few steps on from our path, we are facing a security check. A team seeking to establish security and diffuse the chaos of Minnesota. We've stopped here to check the details of what's going on. We can see a policeman pressing down his pointed knee on the neck of a black citizen called George Floyd." So that's the introduction, and some light-hearted sort of poking sarcasm at the US society. But hear the context now, and that's why I gave that introduction. We can hear the whine of George, who's in his 40s, looks like a criminal, with the dirt and dust of poverty on him due to being on the street life and recklessness. These tough men suspected that George carried a fake coupon, $20, so they decided to lay him on the ground and deal with him violently. Now this is juxtaposed with the story and introduction of Bilal ibn Rabah, who I mentioned earlier, an illustrious companion who the Muslim world loves, the first caller to prayer, the Mu'adhin. And so there's a lot of deference to Bilal in this instance. So he's brought in as an example to say, look, he was a slave, look at the status that he had in the end, look at how another companion, another illustrious companion displayed racism towards him, and how the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, became upset with that and admonished and rebuked that companion for making a statement that was had the connotation of racism upon it. So that was brought in juxtaposition to say, look, George, don't worry, this is what Islam does and how it elevates people regardless of colour, regardless of background. But it's that description there that I've highlighted which indicates the inherent prejudice or superiority that the writer holds from his culture, probably, certainly not from the faith, because as a convert Muslim, Islam does not espouse racism and distinctions according to ethnicity and race in any shape or form, and that's well known. But still, subconscious racism has emanated in this statement, and I will repeat it. We hear the whine of George. In his 40s, looks like a criminal, the dirt and dust of poverty on him due to being on the street life and recklessness, and yet they know nothing about George, his background, his family. Was he a petty criminal? Was he as they described? And that's coming from an Arab perspective. And this is not to say all Arabs are like this. This is not to generalize, but it's to talk about subconscious prejudices and racism and anti-blackness due to perceptions that are age-old amongst particular communities. Drawing to a conclusion, there's more of the poetry, but I won't go into that detail. But I want to highlight, again, this poetry was well-intentioned. It was with good intention to remember George Floyd. It was with good intention to juxtapose it against an illustrious companion who was formerly a slave, But I want to highlight one thing here. Preceding Bilal ibn Rabah being a slave, he came from nobility. His father was actually Arab, his mother from Abyssinia, Ethiopia in those days. And as we know historically, when wars took place, even in Europe, slavery was enacted upon the defeated. Concubines, slaves, the word Slav is in reference to white slaves. This is where that word originates from. Many attribute it to slavery and enslavement of black people. But no, before the enslavement of black people was the enslavement of fellow Europeans, of a lower order, so far as those who were conquering them were concerned. Hence the term Slavs. In drawing to a conclusion, the other aspects or other communities that we need to look at regarding racism is none other than the South Asian community. And I won't dwell upon this too long. There have been some very heated discussions back and forth between black communities and between the South Asian communities. And what has to be acknowledged are those in between who've tried to focus on the religious parameters and dictates that condemn, that censure racism. But like we have laws, civil rights laws of the 60s that promote advancement of all, equality of all in their constitution, the so-called American Constitution has that. Like we have the Race Relations Acts of the 70s in the UK. Superseding that, above that, we have religious dictates. And the reason I'm bringing all of these laws and I'm bringing all of these guidelines is because they're there, but clearly looking at what we're facing in the world today, societally, religiously, they're not being completely adhered to. Because if they were, especially within Islam, the racism that we're seeing between communities, anti-black racism, wouldn't be as prevalent as it is now. And I will conclude on that. And there was some discussion earlier today on social media where a video came from a colleague of mine, and he was enjoining upon some of the traditional communities that instead of advising us how to deal with this issue of George Floyd and the anger that we as Muslims feel, they should look inwardly and address some of the issues that I've just mentioned now. And that upset one or two colleagues, and we had some good discussions about that they herald from those predominant communities. But I also want to say one thing as well to co-religionists of all faiths. We have individuals who then detract, and they're not black, some are white converts, who then say, why are we focusing on this one black individual when we have the suffering of the Uyghurs in China, when we have the Rohingyas in Burma, the Palestinian problem. And this happens all the time, and it always comes from others. When black individuals start speaking and remonstrating and protesting via their platforms about another death, about another oppression against fellow black individuals from the same ethnicity. And I want to ask, why does that happen? Why does that trigger non-black individuals to try and diminish the anger and diminish the focus? This is only one individual. As we saw from another community, Somali community member, who has now been rebuked and chastised by his own community, where he was saying that the miswak that we clean our teeth with is more important than the death of this individual. Why is that diminishing done when it comes to black individuals? You do not see it with any other ethnicity. It's never done. And this is another reason why I'm addressing these particular issues now. Because as a black individual, I like to term myself Afropean to encapsulate the multiplicity of my background. This is unacceptable. And we will speak. We will speak for George Floyd, Eric Gardner, and the multitude of individuals who have been killed by the police because some of us have experienced police brutality ourselves. We will speak whether they're Muslim or not, because the Muslim stands for justice, irrespective of who the victim is. So we will continue to speak out against what's been inflicted upon the Rohingyas. We will continue to speak out about what's happening with the Uyghurs. But do not bring and conflate that because we've now focused on something to do with someone of similar ethnicity and background as us. Desist from this, because it's a very, very crass tactic and one to dissuade us and others from your communities, the Asian, Arab, white communities, to stand in solidarity and feel the anger or empathize with the anger that we actually feel. Those of you trying to diminish that should really check yourselves and join in speaking out against oppression, whoever it may be, wherever it may be.